Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is Kesha Rogers, and I want to thank you guys for coming out. We should have a very interesting dialogue today, coming off a discussion and an extraordinary conference that I had the opportunity to participate in and address in San Francisco, California. I will give some opening remarks, a little bit on the conference, and what direction we should be organizing our forces to be thinking about the two policies shaping the world right now and how we really are the key, Mr. LaRouche, Mrs. LaRouche, and this organization to bring about the destiny for a future which is well deserved for the implementation of who we are really as a human species. What we're going to do today is we actually have a special guest joining with me to join in the dialogue, Beets from our LaRouche PAC science team, basement team. And after I finish my opening remarks, Megan and I will continue to address the theme that Mr. LaRouche has been taking up very emphatically, and that I have led a crucial aspect of the importance of understanding today in the midst of the global threat and crisis facing mankind, what it is that is going to allow for us to free ourselves from a policy that's dominated the existence of society for many years now, many decades, being a policy of zero growth, population reduction, and a policy of an enemy operation around the British Empire to reject the idea of human creativity. And why it is that Mr. LaRouche's policy for a science of physical economy is something that this agenda completely despises. And what you see happening right now in the world was really typified and identified by the two policy choices that we had developed in the conference in San Francisco. I will say that this entire conference, the proceedings of it, are now on the YouTube. You can find the material for that on our LaRouche PAC website. The title of the conference was the theme of "Will the U.S. join the New Silk Road, a choice of global scientific development or nuclear world war?" In this conference, the participation was first addressed from Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, followed by a dialogue and discussion with Mr. LaRouche. Prior to that, we had participation from the Russian Consul General in San Francisco, and then we had, and that was the first panel. On the second panel, we had the participation of former Senator Mike Gravel, myself, which spoke on the second panel, and also Dr. Howard Chang, who is a specialist in water management and gave a very inspiring presentation on the developments of what's going on around the world, around the China water development plans, what's happening throughout Southwest Asia. And what I want to kind of focus on is what I developed, and really what Mrs. LaRouche laid out as the foundation for this conference was crucial to the development of the entire conference, and laying out a choice of direction for mankind. And what she made clear and what we really understand right now is that the policy that's being presented from the collapsing transatlantic system, the British Empire, and the drive toward a provocation of nuclear annihilation couldn't be more stark and more real than people even want to admit. And the problem is, as Mrs. LaRouche made clear in her remarks, is that as long as we are not allow for a denial or an absence of the discussion, which is absolutely necessary to address why it is that NATO is continuing to deploy over 67,000 plus troops into the Baltic region to instigate provocations against Russia and to make the point that Russia is our so-called enemy. Until this reality is understood, that this is a threat to our very human existence, because as later on the Russian General Council made clear, is that when you're talking about a war of aggression or you're talking about a nuclear war, there's no such thing as limited nuclear war. And that anybody who believes that is not in reality and is going to suffer from the greatest of doom to mankind. And I think that's very well worth noting. But what is crucial to understand about this conference, and I thought I was completely inspired and amazed by the level of participation. There were people from all different types of backgrounds, delegation of people from Russian background, Japanese, Chinese, Americans, Democrats, Republicans, whatever, every aspect. And you really had the sense that the LaRouche movement is creating a dialogue of cultures based on the true identity of who we are as human beings, what's going to bring us together. And that, it's absolutely clear that this imperial system for a zero growth policy and to keep human beings barbaric and enslaved is being outflanked. And you're going to hear more of that, how it's being outflanked, from Megan's presentation, and what she'll address here from the standpoint of what we're seeing coming from Russia and China, particularly from China around their moon project and their space policy, and why it is that China represents a threat to this imperial policy. Just as we've seen with what I've exposed around the fraud and the lies of Obama and the murderous policy of President Obama and the continued attack on our space program, what has really been developed is that the attack is on a true human philosophy of the development, not just of technologies around the space program, but the emergence of mankind actually pursuing its destiny in the colonization of space as a key driver for advancing the economy of the world. And this is what China has really developed in its policy for win-win cooperation. Now, I just want to say a couple of quick things here, because this was the aspect of the presentation that I gave in San Francisco, really focusing on both the history of Mr. LaRouche and his very unique conception of economics based on an idea that really is identified around the question of human creativity, what it is that differs mankind from that of the animals. And this being taken up in essence by the works of a great space pioneer who was absolutely instrumental to the development of what became the basis of our space program, of our Apollo mission later, and what actually got us to the moon. But it wasn't just the technologies that he well understood, but Krafft Ehricke he actually understood the philosophy that actually went along with spacecraft and the development of space travel, which was something that those who wanted to remain practical and not go into that domain and say, well, we better stick to something that's not going to get us in trouble. Krafft Ehricke didn't really care about sticking to that which wasn't going to get us in trouble. He was very much like LaRouche, that unless you address the fact that there's a fundamental underlying flaw in the direction of a policy that promotes zero growth culture, and that flaw is going to lead to the stagnation and backwardness of society. It doesn't matter how much spacecraft you develop. It's kind of like, I guess got a report earlier that Elon Musk was saying it was 2025, he's planning on sending human beings to Mars. And, well, basically they might die, say something like that, they might die. What kind of insanity is that? And so, Mr. LaRouche, first of all, I'll just say this, that I wrote a paper prior to going to the conference. I wrote an editorial that's in our Executive Intelligence Review. The EIR magazine is Russia, India, and China Assume World Leadership. The title of my editorial is Toward a New Galactic Man, Krafft Ehricke's Polyglobal World Now Being Realized. And I want to show a couple of things real quick before I turn it over to Megan. Megan has a short period of time with us here. She has another engagement, so I want to share something to kind of segue into what she's going to be doing. Actually, go to the verse, the one on the consequences,
Okay.
the negative consequences.
One shot that.
Oh, ready?
Is it on?
Uh-huh.
The lights off.
Yeah. Yes.
Kill your form gun.
Oh.
Flash your light.
I don't know. Did the bulb go out all of a sudden?
Oh, no.
Well,
No.
you don't think so? The bulb's on.
It's sharing on the webcam.
You just put one in there.
Want the overhead lights?
Well,
If it's not working out, don't worry. I'll just move on.
yeah,
Say
but we're not going to do the thing either. Oh, it's turning on. It's just
Oh.
That just takes a minute.
I don't
Oh.
know why it turned off, but
I don't know either.
Keisha, that was the dark side of the
It
moon.
says no signal.
It was dark side.
Why does it say no signal?
It's coming right now because it's going to get, I don't know what's going to get a signal in 4 minutes.
it's not.
Please be patient for all watching on the.
I don't know why it's plugged into that computer.
Is there a thing that tells you it's on computer 1, computer 2?
No, that's for 1990.
That's what he had in his classroom.
I don't know. It's not connecting to the computer.
Uh-oh.
I don't know if that-
What, you want to start it, press it off, and then start it back again?
That'll take about 15 minutes because that's cool down and turn on.
Oh,
But that's what I have to do.
oh no,
No.
there you go. Whatever you just did. Slap your knee. Slap your
Yeah.
knee. Slap
Okay.
your knee.
It used to be-
All
You
right.
kick it, right? Because
There we go. human beings and creativity
Oh,
and
that
make
was
these
awful.
computers work.
That was awfully hard to read on the iPhone.
It looks better here.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, so I want to just kind of refresh people with this. During my presentation in the San Francisco, I actually developed a little bit more, and there's more. But I want to go back to the essence of Krafft Ehricke's philosophy, which really got at the question of how we address what is happening in the world today, because he understood that there were consequences of human actions, consequences of actions and inactions, and what led to certain policies that would soon become a threat to the existence and stability of mankind. And this is something that we really have to look at today in terms of why it is that we have accepted as a human, accepted these policies which have been a blatant attack on the progress of our true human imperative and creativity. What this is here, this is one aspect of a diagram that Krafft Ehricke created in the 1970s called Consequences of a No-Growth and Growth Paradigm, what he called a open world and closed world paradigm. This is the aspect of the closed world system. And in a sense, it almost seems just like anybody would know this. But the question is the actions taken to prevent such consequences really depends on what we do today. Now, if we're looking at the fact that people are being bombarded by the insane policies of a completely fraudulent election campaign, where you've been given choice of arsenic and cyanide, and you say this is the only choice I have, or you're looking at the fact that we've had the emergence of what Krafft Ehricke rightly understood as a zero growth policy that has been governed by the consequences of actions that leads to stagnation in the world, that leads to a policy which will organize around extreme starvation, extreme poverty, starvation, wars, nuclear wars, revolutions, and so forth. How do we actually organize society to reject these consequences and reject this threat? Well, first of all, what is required is the emergence of a culture based on a new paradigm and a renaissance for mankind. A culture that actually fosters, instead of a policy of chauvinism and a policy that is based on a stagnation, dominant, zero growth society, that the most important thing to the advancement of mankind is the promotion of an open world system which rejects the limitations that we're confined to one small planet, and that we cannot solve the problems facing mankind on this planet. That this policy right now is exactly where we are today if we look at the acceptance of the policy dominating the transatlantic system, dominating the British Empire, being dominated by the British Empire, Wall Street, and a system of speculation and anti-human progress. But what is crucial to understand is that the system which has to emerge is one that's being strongly recognized by the leadership of what Russia and China are doing, along with the 50% of the nations throughout the world that are joining with the actions of Russia and China to create a win-win policy for the cooperation and advancement of mankind. I think I'm done with that. You can take it down.
Okay, nice to look at it.
Yeah, you want to? If people want to.
Yeah.
Would you like me to show you, tell you what it
Blow
says?
it up a little tiny bit for those of us get that.
No, because
You don't
Megan is waiting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, man.
I think
Yeah. It's basically.
We can come back to
we
it.
Can, we can come back to it, and I'll show, you know,
Hit the lights.
show it to you guys. So now, I want to just say that you had two great minds who shared a very common philosophy, who also met and collaborated on occasion, and which was Krafft Ehricke and Mr. LaRouche. A lot of people don't know the history of the LaRouche movement. Schiller Institute, Helga LaRouche and Mr. LaRouche with Krafft Ehricke. And I want to bring this to people's attention. Mr. LaRouche developed quite an extraordinary policy for a space program, which goes back to his policy in the 1980s, where he developed the conception of what came out as a woman on Mars, but also a Mars colonization program. But it was a complete transformation of the conditions of what would actually be the basis for an economic platform that was going to transform the existence of mankind. And this was exactly the thinking of President John F. Kennedy, that what he was actually organizing around was that Kennedy's policy to send a man to the moon by the end of the decade in the 1960s, before he was assassinated, was a grand threat to the environmentalist zero growth population reduction agenda, because they knew it wasn't just kind of plopping some spacecraft and a person on the moon, but that this was going to actually pull mankind out of poverty, pull mankind out of these conditions of a zero growth, anti-progress idea or direction that was being set. And that's why, you know, Kennedy posed such a threat. And what Mr. LaRouche did in the 1980s is that upon the death because of illness of Krafft Ehricke, he actually developed a program in his and wrote about it in his autobiography, The Power of Reason. And it was 1988 autobiography, which people can find this. I would really encourage you to go back and read Mr. LaRouche's history and what led to the development of this program, of his space program that he was calling for. And he has a section in there called My Program to Colonize Space, which was very indicative of everything that Krafft Ehricke represented and his understanding of the philosophy of Krafft Ehricke, but he took this to a completely different level from the standpoint of a real science, of the science of physical economy, which LaRouche is known for. So he actually put this program together upon the death of Krafft Ehricke, and as a part of a conference that was held in Germany in 1985. The conference was on a memorial conference for the life of Krafft Ehricke, and he said there that it became extremely important and understood to him the basis of why a space program that was represented around the principle which he had defined in his work around the Strategic Defense Initiative, and which had been adopted by President Reagan later in March of 1983, was so extremely important, because you were not just talking about the advancements of technology, but you were talking about a new direction and foundation for mankind. Now, so I think that if we look at those consequences of the closed world system that have been presented, and what is absolutely essential to rejecting that direction. The idea of creating a society that fosters genius and fosters the discovery of that which has never been discovered before can be truly exemplified in what is being presented as an alternative by China and what they're doing in their space program, and why it is that you're looking at the rejection of this direction of mankind coming from this British Empire, and even coming from bought off, paid for politicians right here in the state of Texas who say that we have no business working with China because they offer a threat to us. Well, the real threat is their stupidity and ignorance, because we need to be working with China. Most of all the scientific community knows that we need to be working with China on all aspects, including in the space industry, in the engineering of the advancements of infrastructure development plans, high-speed rail systems, which we have none in the United States, and I just heard that the work that we were going to do with China on the program from California to even the short little so-called high-speed rail system, California to Nevada, the Chinese have been ousted from that cooperation. So this is a rejection, as Obama has done, to this cooperation that's absolutely essential to the survival of mankind if we're going to stop this threat of annihilation. And I will let Megan go through further why it is we should be collaborating with China.
Okay. Can you guys hear?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I want to pick up exactly where Kesha left us with the image, or the counterposition between what Krafft Ehricke called the zero-growth closed world and the actual human outlook, which Krafft himself was committed to, which is that there are no inherent limits to mankind. And this was expressed beautifully in his the first of his 3 laws of astronautics, which he laid out in 1957, actually before Sputnik. It was like the month before Sputnik, and several years before any people were in space. He said, "Nobody and nothing under the natural laws of this universe impose any limitations on man except man himself." Now, his optimism and his commitment to that idea, that man inherently had no limitations, led him to the conclusion that man had what he called an extraterrestrial imperative, that space flight, that colonization of space, that man breaking the bonds which tie him to planet Earth and assuming our position as a species in and over the solar system was not an option. It was actually part of the natural evolution of mankind. Now, if man does not realize that extraterrestrial imperative, and then in that case, man is choosing Krafft Ehricke's closed world system. Then man is choosing the same fate as the beasts, as all animal species before him, and all of the consequences. And I think we see that now in the actions of the transatlantic system under the British Empire and Obama. The transatlantic has committed themselves now to a closed world system. And that is evident in many ways, not the least of which was expressed in something that President Obama said back in 2010, where he said, earning himself the first call for his impeachment from Lyndon LaRouche, he said at the Kennedy Space Center, in front of an audience of NASA scientists, NASA administrators, and astronauts, "Now, I understand that some believe that we should attempt a return to the surface of the moon, as previously planned. But I just have to say pretty bluntly here, we've been there before. Now, there are many things you could say about that, about the arrogance of it, but I think that really best expresses this transatlantic commitment to the closed world system, and we've seen the consequences of that as laid out by Krafft Ehricke. We've seen over the past 30 years a complete collapse in the productivity of the countries of the West, and this was just, not that you needed it, but this was just reported in a new study done by the OECD, which reported that, you know, while China's productivity is rising, the productivity of almost every single nation of the West has collapsed. We see this in the fact that death rates among the middle age of society, people that are supposed to be in the prime of their life, that death rates are skyrocketing, that death rates and suicide rates among young people, drug overdose rates among young people are skyrocketing. And we see this in the most urgent way in the war posture that's been assumed by the British Obama under NATO. So you contrast that to what China has done over the same period. Over the past 30 years, China has intentionally lifted 600 million people out of poverty, something that they're very proud of. 600 million people, that's nearly twice the population of the United States, lifted out of poverty over the past 30 years. It's not coincidental that during that same time period, China initiated its manned spaceflight program, which was started in 1992, first under the exciting name of Project 921, and it was later renamed Shenzhou, which means heavenly vessel. Now, that manned space program of China has been developing ever since that time, and has developed to the point that this year, in the third quarter of this year, China will launch the second part of its proto-space station, the Tiangong-2, which will complete its studies of, you know, the technologies needed for a full space station, which they will begin to construct in the near future. And in the fourth quarter, at the end of this year, they will launch their 6th manned space mission, Shenzhou 11, which will consist of 2 people who are going to make a 30-day stay in space, including interacting with the space station, which is the longest stay in space ever by Chinese astronauts. Now, so that's their manned space program. Since 2007, China has been very active both at and on the moon. And I wanted to actually read a quote from the father of the Chinese lunar program, Ouyang Zhiyuan. And he is somebody, he's, I believe, in his late 70s now, if not early 80s. And he's somebody who has been completely fascinated with the moon and the mysteries of the moon since the time he was a very young man. And it was due to his efforts that China began a lunar program. So he said in an interview he gave in 2013, he said, after all of this work, and he's describing what China had done at the moon up to this point, after all of this work, which is that China can make the achievement of arriving at the moon and safely landing, and that we can bring samples back. And once that we have finished all of these unmanned projects, we will send man there. There are many ways humans can use the moon. The moon is full of resources, mainly rare earth elements, titanium, uranium, which the Earth is very short of. And these resources can be used without limitation. The moon is also rich in helium-3, which is a possible fuel for nuclear fusion. This could solve human beings' energy demand for around 10,000 years at least. There are so many potential developments. It's beautiful. So we hope that we can fully utilize the moon to support sustained development for humans and society. So contrast, and you probably already have, contrast that in your mind, what was just expressed by Ouyang Zhiyuan, which is Krafft Ehricke's open world, no limitations on man outlook. Contrast that to what was said by Obama, the been there, done that attitude. Now, what the Chinese recognize, and what most Americans do not even come close to seeing anymore, and what is gripping China right now is the fact that we really have no idea what the moon is. You know, people look up in the sky and see the moon, and Americans might have a glimmer of a memory, and some people a very jaded memory because of the collapse of the space program in the US. You know, you look up and you kind of take the moon for granted. But what China recognizes is we have no idea what this thing is, close as it is to us. We have no idea how the moon was formed. We have no idea why it was formed. And you have hypotheses that have been put forward. But the interesting thing is, every time we've interacted with the moon and taken samples or other things, these ideas have been completely overturned. For example, it was once believed that there was no tectonic activity on the moon, that there simply couldn't be because the moon had cooled and the core was no longer active. Well, that was disproven with the Apollo missions, which put seismometers on the moon. There was also the idea that all of the volcanic activity on the moon, which is what produced these dark patches, was long gone, must have ended somewhere between 2 and 3 billion years ago. Well, it was just released, a study was just done in 2014 declaring the fact that actually there had to have been volcanic activity on the moon as recently as about 50 or 60 million years ago, which incidentally is coincident with a big volcanic activity on the Earth. So these are some of the tantalizing questions that we have no idea about. And you know, then you take, you know, what people say, oh, well, Obama says we've been to the moon. Well, I don't know if anybody has a guess in their mind about how much of the moon's surface has been explored. You can think about it for a minute, but I can tell you that we had 6 manned landings, which included 12 people ever to walk on the surface of the moon. Between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, we've landed between, you know, I think it was 12 or 13 landers on the surface of the moon. They've covered 5% of the moon's surface. 5%. Can you imagine saying that we've touched 5% of the Earth's surface and now we know everything there is to know about it? And just to give a quick example, that Chinese lander, which I'll say something very briefly about in a little bit, that Chinese lander and the accompanying rover, even in the short period of its activity, already discovered a new kind of rock that we had no idea existed on the moon. So these are some of the things that we have to get up there and begin to open up. But one thing I want to focus on, which I think for me is, you know, the real mystery, the big mystery of the moon, is that all of this activity that we've had on the moon, this 5%, it's all been on what's called the near side of the moon. So if you, Ian, if you want to pull up that first slide there for people. So what you see, or maybe we'll see in just a second, is probably a maybe higher resolution, but a very familiar picture to you. This is the hemisphere of the moon called the near side, and this is the only hemisphere of the moon that you will ever see from the Earth. And the reason for that is because the moon is what's sometimes called tidally locked with the Earth. And what that simply means is that the moon spins on its axis at the same rate that it orbits around the Earth, so that it's always showing us the same face, so to speak. Now what that means is that there's a hemisphere of the moon that we never see from Earth. And if you look at the next slide here, this is the far side of the moon. And we did not see the far side of the moon. We had no inkling of what it looked like until 1959, when the Soviet orbiter Luna 3 was sent to the far side to take pictures, and this is the first ever picture of the far side of the moon. So we have no idea, really, what the far side has experienced. Logically, actually, I can put up another image here where you can see a higher resolution image of the near side on the left and the far side on the right. They look very different, right? Now, logically, the moon is one body. So, the far side and the near side should have similar histories, should have experienced the same thing, right? Should be a similar kind of place, but they're not. They don't show us the same history. They actually show us quite the opposite. For example, you see on the left all of these dark patches, which I said were connected to volcanic activity. Well, on the right, you see that there's almost nothing. We have no idea. We don't know why the backside of the moon shows no recent volcanic activity. There are other things which you can see in this next slide, which is a topographical, a false color, obviously, topographical map of the moon, where you can see that the near side has many lowlands, and the far side has what are called the lunar highlands, right? And it also has one of the deepest impact craters in the solar system, the South Pole Aitken Basin, right? So we have no idea why this differentiation. What we do know is that the near side of the moon is always looking at and primarily interacting with the Earth. And the far side is always looking at everything but the Earth, is always looking at the rest of the solar system, is always exposed to processes in the rest of the solar system and the galaxy. Now, we have no idea what the far side of the moon sees when it looks out to the rest of the galaxy. We have no idea what it experiences. To give one example of that, one thing that we know that it experiences but that we cannot imagine or cannot image from Earth is the fact that the far side of the moon is a very dark place. Now, I don't mean dark in terms of sunlight, because some people know the term dark side of the moon. The far side of the moon actually does get just as much sunlight as the near side. But what I mean by dark is that the far side of the moon is almost completely shielded from the radio waves which are coming from Earth. So if your eyes were built to see not visible light, but if your eyes were built to see in the band of the spectrum, which is radio waves, it would be the far side of the moon would be a dark, dark place. Now that's good, because there is a whole area of the electromagnetic spectrum which is called the very low radio frequency span, which we have never been able to see the universe in. We've never been able to have a telescope which is built to pick up those very low radio frequencies and look at the sky. The reason being that there's too much interference from Earth and from Earth orbit. But on the far side of the moon, that's the only place that's relatively accessible to us now where we could possibly go there, set up a radio observatory, and look at the sky with eyes that we've never been able to use before. Now, to give you maybe a hypothesis of the kinds of surprises that might come to us when we do that, if you look at the next slide, these two, as you can probably tell by the titles, these two pictures are of the same thing. The one on the left, this is the Hercules A galaxy. The one on the left was taken, I think, by Hubble, which images the sky in visible light. The one on the right is of the same thing, but imaged with a couple of different radio telescopes in the 1990s. And when they saw, when scientists saw this image, they were completely blown away, because if you look on the left, that fuzzy spot is the galaxy. Now you look on the right, all of a sudden we saw that there were these plasma structures being ejected from the center of that galaxy, which are many, many, many times larger than the galaxy itself. So what process is causing that? What's happening in the center of that galaxy to have created those kinds of coherent structures? What does that mean about the processes occurring in galactic systems? Right? Are they entropic? Are they anti-entropic? So those are the kinds of questions which are immediately thrown open, with this kind of imagery. So, this is one of the things which we know awaits us on the far side of the moon, and the other thing that awaits us, as I sort of already discussed up until now, is the geology of the far side of the moon. Right? We don't know what kinds of resources might be found deeper down. We don't know what kinds of geological formations we might find there. One thing we think we might find is a higher concentration of the fusion fuel helium-3 on the far side of the moon, due to the fact that it's less exposed to Earth's magnetic field, which would block the presence of helium-3. So these are some of the known unknowns. And these are things which we've actually wanted to know for decades, going all the way back to the later Apollo missions. People like Harrison Schmitt, the Apollo 17 astronaut, were pushing for the subsequent Apollo missions to land on the far side. So we don't know, but our first idea of an answer to this question will begin to come just 2 years from now, in 2018. So China recently announced that in 2018 they will be landing a robotic lander on the far side of the moon, and that it will include radio antenna to begin setting up that radio observatory I was referring to. So just to give the lead up to that, I already mentioned that later this year is the next step of the manned program. Next year, China will do something which has not been done in over 40 years, which is they will land a lander on the moon, collect a sample, and return a lunar sample to Earth. That's next year. The following year is when they plan to land on the far side of the moon, and then the probable follow-on mission to that far side landing is going to be a sample return from the far side of the moon, which is going to be really incredible. So to finish up, I just want to say a few brief things about very brief things about China's lunar program. And that is that China's moon program is both quite new and quite old. China, in its history, China has a legend of the goddess Chang'e, and it has a story of this goddess Chang'e along with her pet rabbit flying to the moon to escape Earth. And interestingly, the Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins said that on one of the mornings during which they were traveling to the moon, when NASA gave them a wake-up call and read them some of the day's headlines, one thing they reported to them is that they had learned from China that there's a girl with her rabbit on the moon, and that Neil and Buzz should have their eyes open, keeping a lookout. So this fascination, this connection to the moon goes very, very far back in Chinese history. There's a lot more there that could be said. It's also old, not in the sense that in the 1970s, the Chinese National Academy of Sciences was gifted I think 1 ounce sample of lunar soil by the United States to study. And the person who was put in charge of studying that lunar soil was Ouyang Zhiyuan. Now, the Chinese program is also quite new. It began in 2004, as I said, because of the tireless efforts of Ouyang Zhiyuan. And since 2004, it's progressed somewhat rapidly. I would say even more rapidly than their manned program. In 2007 was the first mission to the moon, China's first mission to the moon. So 2007 and 2010, China sent orbiters to orbit the moon and image it in very high resolution in order to prepare for future landings on the moon. And among other things that were new is that the second mission, which is called Chang'e, they named it after the moon goddess, the Chang'e 2 not only mapped the moon, but it flew from lunar orbit to a point in space called L2, or sometimes Lagrange 2, which is a certain point of stability behind the moon, which is going to be very useful for a far side landing. And then from there, Chang'e 2 flew out into deep space to make a rendezvous with an asteroid. Now, in 2013 was the landing, and if you want to pull up the slides again, oh, just to go back, here is, here's a picture of the Chang'e moon goddess. And in 2013, China really gripped the attention of the world, including Americans, for a brief period when they landed on the moon. And this was the first soft landing since 1976. And as I mentioned, this was the Chang'e 3 lunar lander, and it carried with it the U-2, which is Jade Rabbit rover, which was able to make the explorations, including looking below the surface with radar, sampling rocks, and among other experiments. So now, as I already mentioned, next year is a sample return, and the year after is the far side landing. Now, this lunar program is converging with China's manned space program, and it was announced just less than 2 months ago. It was announced by the government of China that China will land people on the moon in around 2036, which is the earliest possible date, which is based on their development of a heavy lift rocket. So that was just announced officially, but it was the clear intention much earlier. And if you look here, this is the logo of the Chinese Lunar Exploration Program. And so the logo is actually very, very beautiful. It's a kind of stylized picture of the moon, which loosely resembles the Chinese character for moon, which is the last of the 4 that you see up there. But I'm sure you've noticed that the 2 horizontal lines have been turned into footprints. And the end of the brush stroke has been turned into a flock of doves to symbolize that China has peaceful intentions for all of mankind. So this is where China is headed, and it's happening at an accelerating rate. Their space program started off somewhat conservatively in terms of tempo, but it's been accelerating and it's been expanding. And China is offering cooperation to all nations generally, and they're also offering cooperations most especially to countries who don't already have a space program, but who want to send their scientists and their potential astronauts to participate. And this is really encompassing and generating a total optimism in the Chinese population. It's been mentioned before, but I think it's worth thinking about. In 2007, just before the launch of the first Chang'e orbiter, 10,000 Chinese youth were polled. And of those 10,000, 9,500 were following the lunar program closely, and 9,000 believe that they will travel to the moon one day. So this is what China's doing, and I mean they really are leading now. They are leading the continuation of Krafft Ehricke's vision of an open world. They're leading, maybe not in all its aspects yet, but they are leading the commitment to the idea that there are no limitations on mankind and that man does have an extraterrestrial imperative. And for that reason, in a very real sense, the Chinese are much more human than we are at the moment, than Americans are. And I think that should be both a challenge to us, but it's also an opportunity. you know, the United States and our NASA program and the people that were that participated in it, we have so much to bring to the table in terms of collaboration. We have a complete expertise with certain technologies that China is already just building up to now. You know, they don't expect to have their rocket, their heavy lift rocket, ready before 2030. Could that be accelerated if we had collaboration between the United States and China? Could we work together on a joint, mutually beneficial moon program? So, I mean, that's kind of where I want to leave it, mostly because I have to leave in 5 minutes. But anyway, we have a couple minutes for questions, discussion, or if, you know, Kesha, you want to add anything to that, go right ahead.
Okay, Megan, I think what I'm going to do is let people throw their questions to you, and let people throw their questions to you now, since we have a short period of time, and then we can continue discussion here if people have questions for me. So why don't people go ahead with Megan first? We have a question here.
Yeah, Megan, what came up in my mind, listening to your discussion, was are there any significant forces in the space community in the United States which are actively open to this kind of collaboration, or are they all intimidated, you know, by the terroristic attitude of Obama?
That's a really good question, and I say that because it's a question I still have. I mean, from what we've seen, everybody in the space community wants collaboration with China. It's the most natural thing. Charlie Bolden wants collaboration with China, and he very meekly said so at a recent event. Has anybody come forward to really make this the fight? No. But I think we should think of it from the standpoint of active organizing. You know, I think we should really think of going in there and shaking some things down and seeing who resonates with this vision. And I think part of the problem is that the space community and the United States, Kennedy's United States, has been under such attack that people have sort of taken up a defensive position where they try to eke out what they're able to eke out within a contracting budget. And you know, I think if we can really get in there and inspire some people and see who has the kind of identity where they can rise to resonating with that and to acting with us, I think we really have to do that, and I think we might be surprised, and I think we might be able to generate some courage within some people.
Megan, when you look at the near side of the moon, one of the things that you see, in addition to the volcanic darker areas, is there's a very prominent asteroid impact on the moon on the side facing the Earth. And I kind of doubt that came from the Earth. So it kind of begs the question that was the moon always tidally locked? And is this another one of those things that we have to kind of go there to figure out, or are there other ways to learn about some of those things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was actually just looking up a little bit about it before this meeting. It's the Tycho impact crater, and yeah, it's more recent than any of the other impact craters on the near side. At first, it was thought that it came from the breakup of an asteroid, which was, I forget how long ago, but then through various methods, I forget now, it was realized it had to have been more recent. So anyway, that's not really an answer to your question. I don't know. I don't know how much we know about it. I know that it's kind of been a mystery why this thing is there, or how it happened. I don't think it's quite nailed down yet how this thing was formed. So no, I totally think we have to go there. I think maybe we could find out from a distance, but what's the point? I do know that the Apollo 14 crew landed there.
What's the percentage of the Chinese national budget that goes into their space program, compared to the United States. And could you restate the figures on that poll where you said so many people thought that they were going to land on the moon in their life?
Yeah, no, I actually don't know the answer to that question about the budget, but I think that's a great question. Some of it, I will try to find an answer for you. One thing I can tell you is that as opposed to the U.S., in China, all of the rockets are under their military. So that is probably included in their military budget. So I will try to find out. And in terms of the other thing, yes, this was a poll done by the China Youth Daily newspaper. And it was a poll of 10,000 young people in China. And 9,500 were following the lunar program very closely. And 9,000 believed that they would travel to the moon one day.
Megan, I wanted to ask, it's 20 years from now that you said China plans to land on the moon, land people on the moon. That seems like such a long time away, because in our Apollo program, we did it in a shorter period of time. And yet they are catching up and going beyond already in some ways. So why so long? 20 years from now is a long time for as advanced as they already are.
Sure, no, good question. Well, going to the moon depends on having what's usually called a heavy lift rocket, and imagine the Saturn V rocket. Reason being that the rocket has to be powerful enough to get everything that you need to get to the moon and back, all of those components, plus the fuel. You have to lift the unspent fuel up too. So these rockets have to be incredibly large and incredibly powerful. So they, under the current timetable, their heavy lift rocket is not going to be finished until 2030. It's called the Long March 9. And now I only have hypotheses. I will tell you my hypotheses, and these are unconfirmed. In the United States and also in the Soviet Union, after World War II, many of the German rocket scientists from the Peenemünde project came to the United States, and Krafft Ehricke was one of them. Werner von Braun was one of them, and von Braun and others made an attempt to find their compatriots, these rocket scientists, and get them together so that they could go as a team to the United States, where they expected to and did have a chance to actually implement all of the work that they had done over decades on rocket technology. Now, this really didn't happen to the same degree in China. You did have, interestingly enough, you did have a man who's referred to as the father of the Chinese space program, whose name, which I will butcher right now, but it's Tian Shui-sen. And he really was the father of the rocket program in China. China had attempts at rockets during World War II, which were big failures. He came over and actually, over the decades, made a successful rocket program, but number one, it was really him and then the people that he taught. But the other interesting thing about him is that he was educated in the United States, and he was exactly part of this German-based U.S. space program. He was driven out under Trumanism and McCarthyism. So anyway, again, that's my hypothesis. Now what I think, and I kind of already said it, what I think is I think that with collaboration from the United States, I think that it's possible, there's a possibility that we could accelerate that timeline. I don't know that, but I expect that's a question that should be asked. Because for me too, it seems like a very long time.
From the budget, the budget for the Apollo, and said about 5% of it was domestic product. But NASA, now it's 45%.
Of the total.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I thought you was asking a question.
Definitely
And
fine.
the Chinese
Okay.
budget is growing. Well, how's this?
Hold on.
Thank you.
Can somebody repeat that, or was it a question?
Then it's 0.5% now, Joel, of the gross national product in the U.S. for space program.
For the NASA,
It used to be 5% in
5%.
what decade?
it's the 60s.
In the 60s, used to be
Okay.
5%. That's a significant difference.
Okay, I gotta get
Okay. So Megan has to go, and thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you, Megan.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
Okay, see ya. She'll be joining us. Let me also just make a quick announcement here. Are we back? Okay. First of all, I wanted to do this discussion with Megan now as a entryway into further discussion we're going to have. She's going to be here in Texas with us for a few weeks. For those who don't know, there is going to be, she'll arrive tomorrow sometime. We are going to have a bigger conference and seminar, more of a seminar, Megan and I, on the 25th of June, and that's going to be at the League City Library. So that'll be starting at 1 p.m. in League City. We want to do something a little bit special and different along with the presentation, which is going to really focus on the contributions of Krafft Ehricke and, you know, the directions for mankind exemplified by Krafft Ehricke. We also want to actually organize the meeting around the creating of the classical culture that is necessary for bringing about a real space advancement in the space program. So we're going to have a small concert, which will include some classical music and spirituals pieces as well. The event will go from about 1 to 5 p.m. So it will include that. And I encourage people watching online and also in the room to come and bring as many people as possible. So I just wanted to share one thing before we end the discussion here from the standpoint of Krafft Ehricke's understanding of the threats of this zero growth policy. And he was very explicit about it. And you take what he says here in this paragraph, attacking the assumptions of the neo-Malthusian zero growth movement to what Megan just presented. It is absolutely a stark contrast in terms of what China represents as a no limitations on growth being presented in their policy. Anyway, I thought this was pretty fascinating because he just sticks it to these guys. This is, remember, people have heard about the Club of Rome, the book, The Limits to Growth, that were presented, that was written back in the 70s. So Krafft Ehricke says, Meadows and Forrester, in their book, The Limits to Growth, compare the growth of mankind to mindless and senseless multiplication of lilies in a pond. I never considered mankind a lily in a pond, senseless and mindless. The Global 2000 report, a warmed-over version of the original Limits to Growth nonsense, contains outright misinformation and, like its infamous predecessor, totally ignores the human capacity for limitless growth. Growth, in contrast to multiplication, is the increase in knowledge, in wisdom, in the capacity to grow in new ways. And this was Krafft Ehricke in 1982. So take that, Marines. All right, so it's been fun, and we'll be looking forward to a lot more. I think that we've opened up a new direction for the organization with the inspiration of Krafft Ehricke, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that. So thank you.
Thank you.